Hi children, in the last class we learned about the female reproductive system. We learned about the structure of the ovary and also the internal structure of the ovary. And I have mentioned that within the ovary there are many ovarian follicles in various stages of development. So today let us study about how does an ovarian follicle develop. So we are going to learn about the development of an ovarian follicle. So this again shows the sectional view of an ovary. Now you will recollect that the outermost germinal epithelium, the ovary has an outermost germinal epithelium. Within this germinal epithelium there are certain specialized cells. Can you see certain specialized cells? Now these specialized cells are called as the oogonium or the egg mother cell. They are the egg mother cells or the oogonium. So obviously since it is part of the ovary, the chromosome number would be diploid. Okay, it is a diploid cell within the germinal epithelium. And this diploid oogonium starts to divide mitotically. And when it divides mitotically, it produces a large number of cells which starts projecting into the interior of the ovary. The interior of the ovary is known as the stroma. And the stroma in turn is distinguished as an outer cortex and an inner medulla. I am sure you recollect that. So this tube which projects into the stroma is known as the egg tube. And obviously you should remember that all the cells of the egg tube, since it's a mitotic division, would definitely be diploid itself. Okay, so the egg tube has all the cells which are diploid. What happens next? Mitotic division continues. And when mitotic division continues, this egg tube now becomes a mass of cells. Okay, instead of tube, it clusters to form a mass of cells, and that mass is known as the egg nest. Okay, so all the cells in the egg nest again would be diploid in number. What happens now? One single cell in this egg nest transforms itself into a larger cell which is known as the primary oocyte. Obviously the primary oocyte also would be diploid in number. So this cell which I am depicting here is the primary oocyte. Okay, and all the other cells of the egg nest, it starts aggregating around this primary oocyte as a single layer. Okay, it was a cluster, it was a mass of cell here, but now it starts aggregating around this single primary oocyte, and at this stage, this is called as the primary ovarian follicle. It is referred as the primary ovarian follicle. Let me also add that this development is happening before the baby is born. When a female fetus starts developing at a 25-week stage, at the 25-week stage, the ovarian follicle starts developing. So the primary ovarian follicle has one single primary oocyte, which is again diploid in number, surrounded by a single layer of cells, and this single layer of cell is actually the follicular granulosa cell. So this stage we call as the primary ovarian follicle. So this is the primary ovarian follicle. Okay, and it has a primary oocyte inside surrounded by one layer of follicular cell. Let's see what happens next. The follicular cells continue to divide and one more layer is laid down. Okay, so we have now two layers of follicular cells. Along with two layers of follicular cells, from the stroma, there is the consolidation of a layer inside, and that layer is known as the theca externa. Okay, so from the stroma develops a theca externa, and there are two layers of follicular cells. There is still a primary oocyte inside. At this stage, the ovarian follicle is known as the secondary ovarian follicle. So, secondary ovarian follicle has two layers of follicular cells and one primary oocyte inside, along with a layer called as the theca externa. And the theca externa is derived from the stroma of the ovary. Let us see what happens next. From the secondary ovarian follicle develops the tertiary ovarian follicle. How does that happen? The follicular cells continue to divide mitotically, laying down one more layer of cells. So we have 3 layers of cells surrounding. And at this point, the primary oocyte undergoes reduction division or meiosis 1. Remember, meiosis 1 is a reduction division. And when the primary oocyte undergoes reduction division, there is the formation of one secondary oocyte and a small cell which is called as the polar body. So, the primary oocyte is now dividing itself into the secondary oocyte. Obviously, what would be the chromosome number? Since it's a reduction division, the chromosome number would be haploid. So, in a tertiary ovarian follicle, there is a secondary oocyte in the center, surrounded by 3 layers of ovarian follicles, and there is always a theca externa which was developed earlier. Along with the theca externa, from the stroma, there is one more layer of consolidated cells which is called as the theca interna. So we have a theca interna, theca externa, 3 layers of follicular cells and one secondary oocyte within the tertiary ovarian follicle. Let us now discuss about what happens to the tertiary ovarian follicle. The tertiary ovarian follicle matures itself and now it is called as the Graphene follicle. Now please remember that the Graphene follicle is very important as far as the reproductive process is concerned, because it is at this stage that the theca interna of the Graphene follicle starts producing estrogen, the female sex hormone. Normally it is said that the Graphene follicle produces estrogen. But if you have to be very specific, it is the theca interna that produces the female hormone estrogen. Let's see what happens now. Remember that we had a tertiary ovarian follicle. The tertiary ovarian follicle continues to grow. And when it continues to grow, there is an appearance of a cavity inside. And this cavity is known as the antrum. And within the antrum, there is the development of a fluid called as liquor folliculi. Okay, a fluid starts developing and the fluid is called as the liquid folliculi. The development of this cavity and the liquid pushes the follicular cells towards the periphery. Okay, you can see it is getting pushed out. However, the secondary oocyte still remains adhered to these follicular cells, and this in turn is attached to the layer, the outermost layer, by a stalk. You can see a stalk here, and the stalk is called as cumulus oophorus. I don't think you have to study that as far as the NCERT textbook is concerned, but it is called as a cumulus oophorus. So at this stage, we have a mature ovarian follicle which is called as a Graphene follicle. So the Graphene follicle has many layers of follicular cells with a centrally placed secondary oocyte. Please remember that the secondary oocyte which is haploid in chromosome number, is the future ovum. Okay, it's the primary oocyte undergoes reduction division to form a secondary oocyte, and it is a secondary oocyte that later on becomes the future ovum. And we have a cavity called as the antrum filled with liquor folliculi. So this is the structure of a mature graphene follicle. Let us now study about the secondary oocyte or the future ovum. We learned that it is developing inside the ovarian follicle. So we are going to learn about that single cell in detail. The secondary oocyte, being a typical cell, it has a plasma membrane. See, this black color thing is the plasma membrane. And the plasma membrane of the secondary oocyte or the future ovum is known as the oolemma. It's called as the oolemma or the vitelline membrane. The vitelline membrane. Oolemma or the vitelline membrane. Then, within the interior, there is a typical nucleus. You find the nucleus inside the cell. There is also the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm of the secondary oocyte is known as the ooplasm. And just below the oolemma, you find the presence of certain cortical granules. Okay, there are the presence of certain cortical granules just below the oolemma. It plays a very important role during fertilization. Then, outer to the oolemma, there is a glycoprotein layer. Can you see the blue colors which I have depicted as blue? A glycoprotein layer called as zona pellucida. And the space between the zona pellucida and the oolemma is known as the perivitelline space. There's a small space here, and that space is called as the perivitelline space. Outer to the zona pellucida, all the follicular cells become radially elongated, and this radially elongated group of cells appear as flames. Okay, and that is known as the corona radiata. You're very familiar nowadays with the coronavirus, and we have been seeing that picturized in the social media. Just like that, we have radiations, rays of follicular cells radially elongated, and this layer of cells is known as the corona radiata. These layer of cells remain adhered to each other, they're glued to each other by an acid known as hyaluronic acid. That is how they remain glued to each other. Now this is the structure of a secondary oocyte, and you would recollect that it is within the ovarian follicle, attached to the ovarian follicle by a stalk. I was mentioning about the stalk, and the stalk is known as cumulus oophorus. Cumulus oophorus is the stalk that attaches this secondary oocyte to the follicle. So, with this we have completed the development of the ovarian follicle as well as the secondary oocyte inside it.
I hope you recollect that when we studied about the events of reproduction, the first step was gametogenesis. Gametogenesis means formation of gametes. Genesis is to form, gametogenesis, formation of gametes. Gametogenesis is further distinguished as spermatogenesis and oogenesis. Obviously, spermatogenesis is the formation of sperms in males, while oogenesis is the formation of the ovum in females. Let us first study about oogenesis. Now, typically speaking, oogenesis can be studied under three major phases. The first phase is the multiplicative phase, which happens before birth. We have already learned how the ovarian follicle develops in a female right from the 25th week of fetal development. So that phase is called as the multiplicative phase. And during that phase, we have the ovarian follicles, 1.2 to 1.6 lakh ovarian follicles developing within each ovary. Then the second phase is called as the growth phase. Growth phase happens during childhood, meaning from birth till puberty, where there's nothing but the growth of the primary oocyte within the ovarian follicle, and gradually the ovarian follicles start maturing from the primary stage to the secondary stage and to the tertiary stage, as well as to the final stage, that is the Graphene follicle stage. So there's a gradation of development. Not all the follicles develop together, but there is a gradation. But during this process, that is during the growth phase, which happens from probably birth, not probably, from birth till a child attains puberty, meaning till around 9, 10 or 12 years of age, is called as a growth phase. So that is when there is the literal growth of the ovarian follicles. But please remember that even while the ovarian follicles are developing till the secondary ovarian follicular stage, we have the primary oocyte within the follicle which is still in a diploid condition. Let us see what happens next. The next phase, this whole phase, is called as a maturation phase. So the first is the multiplicative phase, which happens from a fetal stage till puberty. Then we have the growth phase from childbirth till the first phase is the multiplicative phase, which happens from the fetal stage till birth. The second is the growth phase, which happens from birth till puberty. And the third phase is called as the maturation phase, which happens from puberty to menopause. Let us see what happens during this phase. We begin with the primary oocyte, because within the ovarian follicle lies a primary oocyte. This primary oocyte, which is diploid in number, undergoes meiosis 1. We have already studied that when I taught you about the growth of the ovarian follicle. I mentioned how the primary oocyte undergoes reduction division, and as a result of reduction division, we have a secondary oocyte and another small cell developing. Whenever there is a meiotic division, there are two daughter cells produced. Both these daughter cells are haploid in chromosome number, and the larger one is known as the secondary oocyte. The smaller one is called as the first polar body. It normally dies. It's a very small cell. What happens next? The secondary oocyte now undergoes meiosis 2. Meiosis 1 is followed by meiosis 2. And meiosis 2, remember, is a equational division where we have the prophase, metaphase, anaphase and so on. The secondary oocyte completes its prophase and enters into metaphase. However, it remains suspended at the metaphase stage, and the metaphase 2 is a relatively long phase. It can continue into anaphase, telophase only when there is an entry of a sperm into the secondary oocyte, or in other words, only when there is fertilization, which we know does not happen periodically from puberty to menopause. It happens occasionally. So the probability of the secondary oocyte completing its metaphase 2 is actually limited. So let us see what happens. The secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2 and it is kept in a suspended state until and unless there is fertilization. When there is fertilization, the sperm actually activates the secondary oocyte, which is remaining in the suspended stage of metaphase, to complete its metaphase 2, enter into anaphase, telophase, and finally divide once again into two daughter cells. Or in other words, a secondary oocyte divides into two daughter cells, one which now becomes diploid. Why does it become diploid? Since there's an entry of a sperm, and since the secondary oocyte already has a haploid chromosome number, this cell, the newly formed cell, which is actually known as the oocyte, or some people even refer it as the zygote. It's called as a zygote only when there is a combination of the genetic material from the sperm and the ovum. But once there is N plus N situation, it is known as the oocyte or a fertilized ovum. So this is a oocyte or a fertilized ovum, and the second daughter cell is known as the second polar body. It is also a small little cell which eventually dies. So in the case of human beings, there are two polar bodies produced, the first polar body and the second polar body. Usually, we know that during meiosis, this secondary oocyte, which is dividing into two cells, similarly, this also, the first polar body also should be dividing into two more cells. However, the first polar body is dying. So, in human beings, there are only two polar bodies developing. Whereas, in other organisms, sometimes there may be three. Two produced here and one here. So, this entire process where an oogonium or an ovum mother cell finally changes itself into an ovum or an oocyte is known as oogenesis. Now, this process has to be understood because there may be various questions asked for your board exams. Sometimes they may say that an oogonium begins with a chromosome number, say 200. What are the chromosome numbers of the following cells? Primary oocyte or secondary oocyte? That can be one question. Or what are the chromatid numbers? So you have to again think. Sometimes this entire diagram can be lifted from the textbook and they may obscure these terms and they may rename it as A, B, C and D and ask you what is A, what is B, what is C and what is D. So be thorough with the diagram that is given in your textbook.